We're here at the Supreme Court Historical Society today with Jeffrey Gonda. He's a professor of history at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and he is the winner of the 2014 Hughes-Gossett Award. That award is given for the best article in the Journal of Supreme Court History. And last night at the Supreme Court, he was awarded the prize by, was it Justice Scalia who
Yes.
presented? Yes. So congratulations, Professor Gonda, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. It's an honor.
So Shelley versus Kraemer is a well-known landmark case in civil rights history. What made you decide to go back and look at this particular case in depth?
So I really became fascinated with the ways in which legal cases could draw out incredible stories, particularly from African American communities, but also the civil rights movement, which was really what I was interested in studying. And I knew that I wanted to look at this era right around the end of World War II and in the decade before Brown versus Board of Education, and try to understand the sort of swirling currents of politics, law, social and demographic change that were all going on in this moment. And housing really seemed like a perfect way to do this, to try and focus in on this issue of urban segregation. And so I looked and saw this case of Shelley v. Kraemer, and it looked like an important case. But I soon found that there hadn't really been a full book-length treatment of this in more than 50 years. And so that obviously piqued my interest, and I started digging into it from that point on.
Who were the Shelley family? Where did they come from? And why were they looking to buy a house in St. Louis?
So J.D. and Ethel Shelley and their 6 children lived just outside of Starkville, Mississippi. And towards the end of the Great Depression, they ultimately became part of what we now know as the Second Great Migration, fleeing the Jim Crow South and heading towards greater opportunities in the North and West. And so they ultimately set out for St. Louis in pieces. J.D. Shelley resolved to leave Mississippi in 1939, shortly after he witnessed the beating of a young family friend of the Shelleys, a young woman who was working as a domestic worker by local police. And he knew at that point that he really wanted to get his children away from the Jim Crow South, and so he left for St. Louis. And after about a year and a half of working odd jobs, he was able to reunite the family towards the end of 1940. For the next several years, they bounced around to a number of different apartments that really struggled to hold such a large family. There was a huge housing shortage in St. Louis and really all over the country at this point. So by 1945, they had ultimately decided that they wanted to purchase a home of their own, and they'd saved up enough money to do so. But what really sealed the deal was when their daughter Letha narrowly escaped being assaulted on the way home from school one day. And at that point, they really knew that they needed to try and find a safer neighborhood. And so they began to set out on the search for a home full-time.
They ultimately bought a house that had a racially restrictive covenant. Why would they look for a house in a white neighborhood? And how were they able to purchase a house with a covenant?
Sure. So as they're trying to navigate this real estate market, they ultimately go to their pastor, who was a part-time real estate dealer in his spare time at the local Church of God in Christ. And so they go to him and say, all right, can you help us to find a home? We know that you're tapped into the real estate market here. What is there that's available? After about a month of showing the pretty meager offerings for African-American purchasers in the city, they're frustrated. They can't find any place that they are going to be able to live. And then finally he says, well, you know, there is this one place over on Labadie Avenue, and I can take you over there and we'll take a look at it. And so they go and they see that there are actually African-American children playing on the block and that there are black homeowners who are ensconced in this neighborhood. And so they decide that they're going to purchase. But on the day that they move into the home, they receive a summons for eviction proceedings because they all of a sudden discover that they have violated this racial restrictive covenant, that the homeowners, white homeowners in the area, had gotten together and formed this agreement to prevent any more African-American homeowners from coming into this particular neighborhood in St. Louis. And so this was ultimately rare in the sort of panoply of restrictive covenants across the country, in that it covered a patchwork of homes around an already existing integrated neighborhood. And Ethel Shelley would say that, you know, had she not seen African Americans living on the block, she would not have really been interested in purchasing in this area. So that was part of what sold her, was that she was trying to move next door to another African American family. But all of a sudden she finds herself facing this racial restrictive covenant, and she realizes that she and her family are about to be evicted.
So who were the Kraemers? Who opposed them buying this house, and did they sue them?
Yeah, so Fern and Louis Kraemer had basically moved into what was Fern Kramer's father's house about a decade before, in the 1930s, after he had passed. And they were longtime residents of the neighborhood at this point. This was where she had grown up. And they were close friends with a local baker named Emil Koob, who was the head of the Marcus Avenue Improvement Association, which was a white neighborhood homeowners group that was really invested in maintaining the white majority that was in this region of St. Louis. And so he ultimately goes to them, says, you know, we are trying to enforce this restrictive covenant. Would you be willing to serve as our lead plaintiffs here? And they say yes, and they remain really engaged in the process. They're attending all of the hearings, they are testifying in the case, and so they really remain engaged throughout.
So the Shelleys needed legal representation. How did they find a lawyer? Who did they choose?
Sure. So at the outset, they were really just confused. They were trying to figure out how this could happen. How were we able to purchase the home, and now you're telling us that we're about to be evicted? And Mrs. Shelley talks about this as, I just wanted to figure out what was going on. And so she goes to her realtor. She goes to her pastor and realtor and says, what is happening, and can you help me? And so it turns out that he had never really informed them that there was this restrictive covenant covering the property, right? Yeah, it was sort of dubious, and this is going to land him in hot water before the Missouri Real Estate Commission for his actions here. And so he ultimately then says, okay, well, look, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk to these other African-American realtors in the area, and we'll get together and we will pay for a lawyer for you. And so they ultimately enlist the aid of George Vaughn, who is this longtime civil rights advocate in St. Louis. He's one of the more notable figures in the local community. He's been a politician, a civil rights litigator, and a local community leader. Is known as a great orator, as somebody who can really pack the halls of the local YMCA whenever he's speaking and really get people fired up. And so all of a sudden he is now stepping in to take over their case. And he's also, however, going to have to navigate being paid by these realtors who have sort of pushed the Shelley family onto the front lines of this battle over urban segregation.
When you started your research, did you realize that you would be exploring tensions in the local Black community and their impact on legal activism, or did that come as a surprise to you once you had your research well underway?
You know, this really came as something of a surprise. I sort of anticipated going into this study of Shelley v. Kraemer and finding it to be a fairly traditional civil rights case where the NAACP is deeply involved from the start, and people have some disagreements, but they ultimately are all pursuing the same goal. And as I began to dig into this, it pretty quickly became apparent that that was not the case at all here. And that there were these remarkable tensions and disagreements over how this was going to work, and the ways in which realtors were becoming involved in pushing this case forward, really over the NAACP's objections. And so all of this really quickly came out. And so teasing out these dynamics of how local communities and how local actors are shaping and influencing and affecting the trajectory and pace of litigation and legal reform more broadly really became one of the central goals of my work.
Tell me about how the case made its way up to the Supreme Court and about the appellate process. Was the NAACP involved at every step of the way?
So the NAACP really doesn't like the Shelley case. This is something that this group of realtors in St. Louis ultimately decides that they are going to push over the NAACP's really strong objections and at certain points in the process, active efforts to try and undermine the case. So the NAACP really does not want to be left out of the loop. They've got a couple of test cases that are percolating through the courts in California and in Illinois that they've been building for years and that they really are confident are going to be their best potential shots at getting a victory at the Supreme Court. And since they're investing so much time and money into these litigation campaigns, they really want to make sure that it is a hand-picked case of their choosing that is ultimately going to make it to the Supreme Court. And Shelley is very much not that, right? They have not really had any say in this development at all. And so they pretty actively try to dissuade George Vaughn and these realtors from moving forward. But the realtors are saying, well, we're not really willing to set aside the Shelley family's desires or our own financial interest in seeing this issue adjudicated. And so they try and push forward. And at that point, the NAACP starts trying to convince various groups like the ACLU to not go along with this case. Say, look, this case is going to lose. This is not the one that we want to take to the court. This is going to be dangerous to our overall efforts. So please do not support it. But in the end, they realize that these brokers, these real estate brokers, are going to go forward with or without their consent. And so they decide that they are going to grab the closest case that they can, which is ultimately one from Detroit. And that they are going to put this up alongside the Shelley case and go up to the Supreme Court, really alongside but not in full cooperation with George Vaughn and these realtors from St. Louis.
Interesting. But ultimately, they were victorious before the Supreme Court. Can you tell me what was the vote breakdown? Was it unanimous?
So it was unanimous, but interestingly enough, it was actually a 6-0 decision. 3 of the justices recused themselves from the case. Though they didn't explain why, it was generally understood that it was because they each owned covenanted properties, which sort of gave an indication of how far covenants really reached and how deeply they cut through a lot of American society. Observers in the court at the time, because the Shelley case was so important, said that the only empty seats in the Supreme Court chamber as these cases were being heard were these 3 seats that had been occupied by the justices who sort of stood up and walked out when the case was called. So it is this sort of remarkable moment that seems to throw the entire future of the case in doubt when it happens. And most of the people who are watching the case, most of these observers and the NAACP litigators are trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean?
So what was the impact of the outcome of the case on the Shelley family personally?
So the Shelleys are understandably overjoyed when they learn that they are going to be able to keep the home. They really had not gotten to spend a single night in the house without having the threat of eviction looming over their heads. And their phone is ringing off the hook throughout that entire first night with calls from all over the country congratulating them and ultimately calls from overseas as well, because people really had a great deal of hope that this case, that this victory would be able to change the trajectory of American urban segregation, that this would ultimately spell the end of American racial ghettos. And the Shelley family is going to go on and live in the home on Labadee Avenue for another 10 years after this decision. And so one of the points that I make in the article is that as we are trying to understand the ways in which legal history and civil rights movement history are overlapping and intersecting, or what we can draw out of these stories of the law, and the ways in which the law is affecting the daily lives of African Americans and Black communities across the country, is by looking at individuals like the Shelleys, is by starting in their homes on the night when these Supreme Court victories come, by looking at the next decade of their lives that they are able to live in these areas. And then we can really begin to see what this means, that this is something that is not an abstract set of ideas, but that is tangible and very real in their lives.
So I understand that you are expanding this article into a book.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So this research is going to be appearing in a book that is coming out from the University of North Carolina Press through their Justice, Power, and Politics series this fall in October. And the book is called Unjust Deeds, the Restrictive Covenant Cases and the Making of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's got not only more of the Shelley's story, but also for the other 5 African-American families who are at the heart of the companion suits here, their stories as they found their ways really from these segregated neighborhoods across the country in Detroit, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C., all the way up to the Supreme Court and then back into the neighborhoods as the country began to wrestle with what this decision would ultimately mean.
I look forward to reading that.
Thank
So
you
it
very
comes out in
much.
October?
It does, yes.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Gonda,
Thank you.
and congratulations on winning the Hughes-Gossett Award.
And thank you. It's a tremendous honor, and thanks for having me.